time will fly by, so do not adjust that radio, because there is a lot of politics to come over the next 3 hours, and indeed there has been a lot of politics, as always, just gone in this week that is in many ways, of course, in Westminster it's called a set-piece event, as if it's some sort of weird football thing that I don't really understand. One of those moments where politicians and journalists get extremely excited, particularly when you have a government such as this one, which is on the skids, which is declining with each passing day, where despite all of its best efforts, it cannot seem to reinvigorate itself, it cannot seem to revivify itself, it cannot seem to try and find something which finally appeals and gets itself out of the rut in which it finds itself. There are vanishingly few, of course, of these so-called set-piece events to come, even if you buy the idea, by the way, that they do make much difference. Most people tend to, in my experience, pay attention to the budget mainly to see what's going to happen to their fuel or the fags or the booze or whatever it happens to be. But even if you buy the analysis that it does, there are increasingly few of them. And there was, of course, as there always is, a lot of activity around it, a lot of pressure groups and other political groups and regional parties, all the rest of it, national parties, Labour Party, carping from the sidelines, criticism, that is of course absolutely natural, lots of particular pressure groups and so on saying we should have had this and we should have had that. But there was really a fantasy lurking at this budget, as there so often is fantasy haunting Westminster politics and the corridors of Westminster usually, but even more so it feels of late, which is this. Britain has been stuck in a period of secular stagnation for year after year after year now. And the truth is, at this point, neither of the main parties are committed to anything that really resembles a growth plan. Neither of the parties are really committed or have done the serious thinking, despite the fact that this stagnation in our productivity and our living standards, the worst period since the Napoleonic Wars in terms of stagnation of living standards and decline in real living standards. Despite that fact, and maybe it's partly because we've been living in this era of a perma-crisis where the government, sometimes its fault, sometimes not its fault, has limped from crisis to crisis, buffeted by often events not entirely of its own making. Maybe it is a result of that the intellectual thinking, either at the heart of the Conservative Party, who are intellectually exhausted in all sorts of different ways, or even in the Labour Party, where you can compare them to their equivalents, say New Labour in 1996, 1997, or David Cameron's Conservatives in 2009-10, parties on the precipice of power, clearly on the precipice of power. The truth is that the intellectual project around Keir Starmer, the deep thinking about how to shift Britain's economy and society, is pretty nascent, or even, dare I say it, in some areas non-existent by comparison to the intellectual projects that existed under Cameron and under Starmer and under Tony Blair, I should say, sorry. And that is pretty worrying when you consider that actually by comparison to 96, 97 or even 2009, 2010, the scale of the crisis the British state faces in every direction is profound. And this has all sorts of manifestations. The fact that, according to these, when I say that the budget is based on fantasy, the fact that you have a situation where so many of the spending assumptions that Jeremy Hunt is saying is underpinning the next year and the year after that and the year after that are clearly based on undeliverable cuts to public services, which in many cases have already been pared to the bone. Fantasy. And another fantasy too, the idea that we're going to be able to abolish national insurance at some point. Fantasy. And then another fantasy, what Jeremy Hunt said about defence, which said that he was going to promise to increase defence spending up to 2.5% of GDP when economic conditions allow. And the thing that I think more than anything else about British politics right now, and I want to focus on this issue of defence, which I think has been much underreported and under-discussed in British politics of late. You might think, mightn't you, that in a situation where Britain is facing its darkest, or the world really, never mind Britain, solipsism again about Britain, the world, the West, is facing some of its darkest moments since the Second World War, of geopolitical unease and angst. Russia, which has transformed into a war economy, and although it started the Ukraine war off badly, is getting itself into a stronger position, still got enormous problems, but getting itself into a stronger position through its transition to a war economy. With everyone knows that if Ukraine falls, that that Putin could be on the gates or threatening the Baltic states, threatening Poland NATO members, potential conflagration. In that circumstance, let alone the Middle East and all of the military requirements there, in these circumstances, you might just think that the hermetically sealed bubble of Westminster might look at these things, recognise them, start to talk about them, and actually start to have a very serious conversation both with themselves internally but also to the public about the fact that we are in changed circumstances geopolitically. It's not 1998 or 1999 anymore or 1989. The world has changed. Not even 2001 or 2002 when we were talking about taking on non-state actors, the idea of kind of rogue states or states which were going to just take other bits of other countries by conquest. That seemed like something from another age or the 19th century. That is exactly the era we are in again. And it is cliche, and I'm often abhor making reference to it because I often think that if you just compare everything to the 1930s, it's usually a sign that you've lost the argument. But it is hard not to conclude or look at the current state of the world, a multipolar world, a world with declining old empires and rising new powers, an older dominant force, i.e. in this case the United States, struggling to keep the peace and keep order, just as Britain did before the outbreak of the First World War or indeed the Second World War. And it's hard not to see with a rising power, or a power which is constantly trying to use aggression on its neighbours, and where what the watchword that everyone ought to be talking about is deterrence, it isn't hard to see parallels and comparisons and wondering whether we are making exactly the same mistake as they did in the 1930s. Except the difference, of course, in the 1930s was that by the end of the 1930s, you had politicians who were talking about rearmament, talking about the sort of sacrifices that might have to be made in order to deter aggressors, which, by the way, will pale into insignificance by comparison to the actual cost of fighting a war with a country like Russia. Deterrence now, money to Ukraine now, resources to Ukraine now, actually, in the end, save us money and save us lives. And despite that fact, in the budget, there was not a mention of an extra penny piece for defence. As I say, Hunt at some point says it would like to get it up to 2.5% of GDP. Everyone knows about the difficulties with the public finances. Everyone knows that. But the Chancellor is cutting taxes. That's his right, and that is a legitimate point of view. But in a circumstance where, as I say, we are facing the worst geopolitical situation, something I can remember and people older than me can remember, the worst for decades and decades, can it be right that the Westminster conversation seems so at odds, seems so internal, so insular, so inward-looking by comparison to this darkening world around us? And ought we not to be having a conversation, and politicians have a conversation with the public about how dangerous the world is turning and how we as a country might have to prepare for that? Now, Treasury Minister Gareth Davis spoke to LBC this morning, and he denied that our armed forces are being underfunded.
We have record funding going into our defence sector. We uplifted defence spending by some 11 billion at the last spring budget. I think there's about 50 billion being spent this year. As you know, the nature of conflict has changed, and so it means money is spent in different ways, particularly on new technology. And if you look at the programme of investment, we've got new submarines, we've got new frigates, so investment is going in, and it has been increasing over the years, not least at the last spring budget, which we saw £11 billion uplift.
But that rosy picture is not mirrored by the Public Accounts Committee, very well-respected cross-party body of MPs who've warned today that the UK will be left increasingly reliant on military allies because of a £29 billion financial black hole in defence spending. They've said that the government currently lacked a credible plan to fund the Ministry of Defence. And the Public Accounts Committee has said this undermines the credibility of Britain's armed forces. I mean, this is what I can't quite get my head around. And this moment, of all moments, this might have been all right, probably not all right, but it would have been a little more explicable if it were, 1999, when the entire geopolitical sea before us looked calm and without so much as a tiny ripple on the waves. And yet here we are, potential geopolitical tsunamis all around us, and we've got the Public Accounts Committee saying that the government is lacking a credible plan to fund the Ministry of Defence. This seems crazy to me. And I want to talk to you about whether you agree and whether you think that, given we've got Russian aggression and unrest in the Middle East, are the government letting us down and letting future generations down by failing to invest in our armed forces? And are they not storing up big problems potentially for the future. 0345 6060 973. 0345 6060 973. Text 84850. First, though, let's talk to General Sir Richard Barrons, former commander of the Joint Forces Command.